Hello and welcome to today's Office Hours presentation. This is Paul Hoyt, your host. Our Office Hours presentations is a relaxed, informal mentoring program that we hold every Monday at noon Pacific time. All these recordings, slides, and exercises are archived in the members area of our website, and then all the recordings are available on my YouTube channel at youtube.com/user/Paul Hoyt. The reasons we do these office hours presentations is that we know that being a successful small business owner can be a fantastic experience, but we also know that it's tough. You need education, training, tools, and teams in order to be successful, and we want you to get to know us. Because when you get to know us, you'll know that first and most importantly, we really care about you. We want you to be successful in every area of your life, whatever that means to you. We want you to find the greatness, the happiness, the divinity within yourself, and then remember it, embrace it, and live it every single day as we try to do. Our passion is to increase the survival rate, accelerate the growth rate, and reduce the struggle rate of businesses in America. And our vision is to help millions of CEOs and entrepreneurs accelerate their business growth while experiencing greater peace and harmony and balance in their lives. And you can pass the word. If you find these office hours presentations valuable, I encourage you to pass them along on social media or through your networks, or if you run across anybody who is struggling or you think might gain value from the education and training that we provide on these office hours presentations, please let them know about it. Encourage them to sign up so that we can continue to communicate with them and so they can gain the value out of these presentations as you have. Our office hours agendas are usually an in-depth discussion of a business success principle. I offer some closing remarks, special offers, and invitations for future sessions, and then we go into open Q&A and coaching. So as you're listening to today's office hours presentation, take notes on questions that you would like to ask or discussion topics that you would like to entertain, and when we get to the end of the call, we'll open it up and we'll have a bit of a conversation. Also encourage you to join us on social media with the Awakened CEO communities on both LinkedIn and Facebook, where I publish a business success principle of the day 4 days a week on both Facebook and LinkedIn, and then I do an energy of the day posting on Facebook. We're coming up on 2 years straight of doing an energy of the day posting every single day. I think we're up to number 729. I also want to make you aware of an Awakened CEO strategic planning virtual event that we do once a quarter, and this quarter's event is coming up on Saturday, December the 5th. Where you can begin planning for 2016 and put your plans in place for finishing out 2015. You do have to sign up for this event separately from either the Awakened Conversations or our Office Hours series. So go to paulhoyt.com, strategize with Paul. That's paulhoyt.com/strategize with Paul in order to sign up, and watch your emails because we'll give you some more email invitations here in the coming days. Today's topic is about who's your buddy, all about joint ventures. As always, we try to relate the subject matter of the day to one or more of the key performance areas of success, and starting and managing joint ventures is purely a function of leadership. So it's your responsibility as being the CEO or the owner of your own business to determine whether or not you should have a joint venture with another business owner and how to set it up, and go through all of the things we're going to talk about here in the next few minutes or so. We also try to relate the subject matter of the day to our Awakened CEO system, multiple levels of performance. So our Awakened CEO system is a balanced and comprehensive approach to business growth on the multiple levels, on the levels of mindset, methods, and momentum. And today is strictly about methods. So the mindset is kind of a given with the joint venture, that you want to partner with somebody else in order to accomplish a common business objective. But we're going to talk about the methods, about how you do that, about how you create a joint venture, manage that joint venture, and receive benefit from that joint venture in today's conversation. With our agenda today, we're going to talk about the multiple types of joint ventures. We'll talk about the legal structures available for joint ventures. We'll talk about defining your joint venture, implementing your joint venture, and managing your joint venture today. And then we're going to sum it all up with the bottom line. When it comes to the types of joint ventures, really you can have a joint venture in any one of the 7 key performance areas of business. You can have a joint venture for leading businesses. You can have one for sales and marketing. You can have one for delivery of products and services and operations and product development. But the most common types of joint ventures that we're going to talk about are in these areas: technology and product development, operations, delivery, and sales and marketing. And we're going to talk about each one of those 4 types of joint ventures separately and give you some ideas about why companies might want to come together and have a joint venture in these different 4 areas of business. First, let's talk about technology. The most common type of technology joint venture that I have seen is when companies come together to establish a research facility. One of the ones that we knew about in the early 1980s, I think it was where IBM and Texas Instruments and Intel came together to form a research facility outside of Austin, Texas, to design and to implement or design and manufacture chips, semiconductor chips. Each one of the companies realized they needed to have additional capacity, and they felt like by coming together and having a research facility that they would be money ahead. And they decided as a result of this joint venture that they would each share in any sort of patents or intellectual property that came out of that research facility together. You can also come together to fund research from third parties. Typically, if there is a single third party that you want to invest in, you simply invest in their business. But you could come together with some of your partners, such as the high-tech example that we offered a few minutes ago, and develop a fund to go out and invest in research from multiple third parties. So we oftentimes see that, even a little bit of a hedge fund or even a venture kind of fund, where companies will come together and create a fund to go out and invest in technology so that they can share in whatever technology is created equally. Once you find that the technology has been created, you can create a joint venture for operational purposes. You can, in simplest fashion, you can get together to purchase an office space. So let's say that myself and if I were an attorney, I know that I've got 10 or 12 other attorneys who are looking for new office space. We might go together and establish a joint venture in order to purchase an office building and decide to share and support staff and share in the appreciation of the asset that we have formed. Another example of an operational joint venture is a captive insurance company. I don't know if you've heard about these or not, but instead of going to other insurance companies and purchasing your unemployment insurance or purchasing your liability insurance, your property insurance and casualty insurance, that sometimes companies go together and create their own captive insurance company, because it really does reduce the cost overall of insurance if it's done properly. You may also decide to build a new business out of that. We oftentimes see, for example, in the venture that we talked about before with 10 attorneys coming together to establish a new office space and purchase an office building, they might decide that they're going to sublease different floors of that office building into different types of professionals, medical professionals or accounting professionals or consulting professionals of other kinds, and they actually establish a new business around the facility that they have purchased together. You can also establish a joint venture for delivery purposes. So for example, we might decide to go together on a warehouse. We're using, me and some of my friends may be using a fulfillment center on the East Coast, and we realize that we're not large enough to purchase our own warehouse and have our own staff, but if we went together with several of our business associates, that we might together form a large enough enterprise to have our own fulfillment center, to purchase our own warehouse and to staff it and create a joint venture in that way. And we could also share delivery teams when it's appropriate to share the delivery teams. And we could decide to start a new business around that. In addition to our businesses that we would put into the new fulfillment center, we may elect to offer logistics services and fulfillment services to any other person who wanted to have a fulfillment center, and therefore compete with the people who are probably already using for a fulfillment center on the East Coast. And the last one I want to talk about is sales and marketing. In this case, we may decide to start a brand new company to market and sell products and services in a new territory, or into a new market segment. This is very common when we want to expand overseas. So if we want to sell our products into Mexico, for example, we might create a joint venture with some Mexican companies that we know and develop a joint venture in order to put our sales and marketing, to extend our sales and marketing reach to that foreign country. Many foreign countries, by the way, have procedures that says that in order to sell products and services into their country, that the company selling into that country needs to be 51% owned by a citizen of that country. So we're almost have to develop either a partnership alliance or a joint venture with somebody in that foreign country in order to extend our products and services to that foreign country. If we are putting together a joint venture with somebody other than who's just going to do the sales and marketing, but is also going to contribute their own products and services to the joint venture, then we have to make sure that it's very, very complementary for brand awareness purposes. So in many cases, we can form joint ventures that have a different name that people really don't trace back to the parent companies, but it's hard to do from a sales and marketing standpoint. My belief is that you have to have very complementary products and services before you can create a joint venture for sales and marketing purposes. So when it comes to the 7 key performance areas of success, these are the 4 different areas that I see most commonly addressed through joint ventures. Take the technology and product development area, the operations area, the delivery area, and the sales and marketing area. When it comes to forming a joint venture, we have a lot of options when it comes to the legal structure. We can form a C corporation, an S corporation, an LLC, or a partnership, those being the 4 most common types of corporations that I see formed for joint ventures. There are, by the way, 17 or more different types of legal entities and legal structures. You can have a limited liability partnership, a general partnership, a limited liability, or limited liability company. Anyway, there's lots of different variations that you can have that I can't recite off the top of my head, because these are the 4 most common types of legal structures I see when it comes to joint ventures and businesses of all kinds. You can establish a joint venture by contract only, but by my definition, that's not a joint venture, because when I think of a joint venture, I think of a venture, I think of a company. It is possible to have, a relationship so legally identified and constrained by contracts and agreements that it would just be really kind of be a separate company, and defined by contract instead of being defined by a legal entity. But generally speaking, that's not done. Generally speaking, joint ventures apply to the term, is a term that we apply whenever we have actually created a brand new company. When it comes to defining our joint venture, there are several things that we want to pay attention to. We want to pay attention to the initial contributions and rewards. We want to pay attention to ongoing contributions. We want to pay attention to changes in equity, changes in compensation, and changes in compensation over time, and how we're going to dissolve that joint venture, which is, strangely enough, one of the things that we definitely want to talk about as we're forming the joint venture. Let's talk about each one of these areas separately for just a second. With regards to initial contributions and rewards, we want to understand what each party is putting into the venture, how much time they're going to contribute to the venture, how much money they're going to contribute to the venture, and any intellectual property that they might license to or sell to the new venture. And then we want to talk about the rewards that they would get for those initial contributions, rewards in equity or rewards in compensation rights and privileges. For example, I decide to put in $100,000, you decide to put in $100,000. I'm going to run the venture, so I'm going to put in more time, but you're just going to have a money-only investment. Maybe we own 50-50, but maybe I have a greater right to the revenues or the profits of the venture based upon my my contribution, which is greater than your contribution to the venture. We also need to talk about what we're going to do ongoing. We need to talk about roles and responsibilities, who's going to manage the venture, and what roles and responsibilities we might each take into the venture, and what the performance expectations are of the venture itself, and our performance expectations of our ongoing contributions. We want to define what our measurements of success are as well. And we want to define how our equity position might change over time with additional stock or option grants, or whether or not either one of the joint venture partners has the ability to purchase additional equity in the company, and any other exchanges in equity that we might have. For example, can I exchange my equity? Can I transfer this? Can I sell my equity to another party, or is that restricted by our original agreement? We also want to talk about compensation, which is how much we're taking out of the venture, how much we're going to share from a revenue or a profitability standpoint, whether or not either one of us is entitled to any sort of expense reimbursement, or if any one of us is entitled to fees for the services that we provide to the joint venture, and whether or not we can have commissions based upon selling things or facilitating the sale of any of the products and services of the joint venture, and whether any one of us is entitled to a salary or a draw against commission based upon our contributions to the joint venture, and finally what sort of distribution of profits that we might have from the joint venture. And curiously, it really pays off to be focusing a little bit of time and attention on the dissolution of the joint venture. What happens if one of us departs, or what happens if one of us passes away? What happens if we have a disagreement that we simply cannot resolve? What happens if somebody who is supposed to be participating in the joint venture is no longer able to participate, either through disability or some sort of operational deficiency? What happens if we just have dysfunction, if we just decide that, we can't work together anymore? And define the terms under which we might buy or sell our interest in this particular partnership, in this particular joint venture. So when you think about having a joint venture, which is forming another company with a partner that you already have, think about these 5 things around the formation of that joint venture, about who's going to put in what and what sort of ownership position they might enjoy, or what are their rights and privileges that they might enjoy from those initial contributions. Think about ongoing contributions, who's going to do what over time and what sort of rewards they might get from that, and how equity position might change over time, what sort of compensation that one might get from their contributions, and should we decide to dissolve this, let us agree up front how we're going to do that, how we're going to value each person's contributions, and how we're going to manage the process of stepping back from the joint venture that we have formed with each other. Once we've talked about all the definition of the joint venture, then we can talk about implementing the joint venture. We can talk about forming the JV management team, which is critical. In some cases, I will take somebody from my team and you'll take somebody from your team, and they'll be the executives in the new venture. In some cases, we might want to hire a separate party who neither works for you nor me to manage that venture, and it's important for us to define that up front. We may then want to exchange products and information and do a necessary training that may be necessary of the staff that we have in our new company. And then we want to establish a program to in an ongoing manner, mentor the new staff that we have into the facility. We want to set our schedules and our performance goals before we launch the venture, and launch the venture is step number 6. So we want to get the team in place. We want to make sure that appropriate amount of product and information has been exchanged. We have the legal paperwork in place, that we train and mentor the staff that we have in place, that we've agreed upon what our schedules and performance goals are going to be, and then we launch the venture. And after we launch the venture, then we get into managing the new venture. We want to make sure that we have point persons, and that is the new management team and somebody at your company and somebody at my company who is responsible for the success of the joint venture. And that's real important. You want to have a win-win skin-to-skin in scenario implemented. So win-win means that you can win and I can win. Skin-skin means that we both are invested into this joint venture and that we have point people established who are responsible for the success of the venture. We want to make sure we know who's going to produce the progress reports and how often they're going to be produced. We want to have periodic meetings of a board of directors, as you will, of the new joint venture and make sure that we have appropriate financial controls in place so that we can both be assured that our initial compensation objectives and our initial contribution objectives are being managed and our ongoing withdrawals from the business, compensation-wise, expense-wise, or profit-wise, are really happening the way that we expect them to. Here's an example of a joint venture that we might form. In fact, this is an example of a joint venture that I had the opportunity to participate in from just a few years ago. Let's say that we decide to do a series of workshops together. You're going to speak, I'm going to speak, we're both going to sell our own products and services, but we're going to do it on a massive scale, a really massive scale, like a 50-city tour over a year-long tour. And in every single city, we're going to have 10 or 15 or 20,000 people in the audience. So this sort of joint venture is not just you and I deciding to do a workshop somewhere, go to webinar that requires very little planning and very little investment. This is a venture that's really going to require a significant amount of planning, a significant amount of investment. It's really going to impact your company and my company because of the magnitude and the scale of it. So we decide to go out for additional investors and we decide to form a new venture in order to make this happen. And when we do so, there's a lot of questions that need to be answered. One of the questions is, how do we fund the venture and how much money will it really take? And of course, that means that we have to have fairly detailed plans and financial models in order to determine the cash flow that's going to be required from that venture. And it's likely that when we set up the new company, and in this case, I'm going to say we will set up a brand new company, that we wait to decide how we're going to set up the company, how we're going to form the legal organization until our plans are in place. And then we have to figure out who is actually going to schedule and pay for the venues, likely going to be investments required in the new venture, where they're going to sign up the people and they're going to take the money in order for the new venture. But we have to decide how we're going to get square with each other, how often we're going to report the financial results, how often we might both enjoy the profits from the venture, and how we might enjoy compensation from the new venture as it's ongoing for quite a long period of time. And then finally, we have to ask ourselves and reach agreement on how we're going to end the new company. In this specific example, the company might actually end 6 months to a year after it was formed. As it turns out, when you shut down a company, there are typically the state governments will want you to have that entity around, or at least have a registered agent of that entity around for a year or so after you decide to shut the business down, in case there's any actions that they need to follow up on from the state. But that's kind of an example of a joint venture on something that would normally be an alliance or partnership, but because of the scale of the plans that we had in place, we decided that it was probably best to form a brand new company, fund that new company, have new management team with that company, and then get square with each other in some way. So here's the bottom line. The bottom line is that there are a lot of things to consider when you're establishing a joint venture or really starting any sort of new business whatsoever. And thinking it through is really going to save you a lot of time and money and perhaps a tremendous amount of grief. And we strongly encourage you to get a coach to help craft the relationship and an attorney to help review any agreements that you have and help you form the new company if in fact you decide that the new company is necessary. That's been our agenda for today. We talked about the types of joint ventures. We talked about legal structure. We talked about defining your joint venture, implementing your joint venture, and managing your joint venture. And then we summed it all up to the bottom line. So here's your homework and your exercises. Make a list of any sort of joint ventures you have or would like to have. Think about who you would trust to start a business with, to be a joint venture partner with, and then download the joint venture worksheet that's going to be available on the Tribe portal when I publish this recording a little bit later today, and use that as a discussion guide and complete it whenever you have a joint venture opportunity. We're going to open the lines for questions and answers and coaching here in just a minute, where we invite you to have comments and questions on the topic of the day and then any other issues that you want to talk about. You can talk to me about what your biggest takeaways are and what insights that you gained from this presentation, and tell us what you're going to focus on. Here at the Hoyt Management Group, we are proud to offer a wide variety of support services where we have a model to teach you and educate you so that you can do it yourself. We actually pick up the phone and pick up the keyboard and do things with you, like collaboratively create strategic plans, business plans, financial models, sales scripts, sales strategies, etc. And in some cases, we'll actually do it for you. You can outsource some of the things that you might want to do to us so that we can do it for you and be a member of your operational team. Our next office hours is going to be on next Monday, November the 30th. I haven't decided on the topic that we'll have. It's most likely going to be, by the way, live group coaching, because this is a holiday week and I don't want to spend a tremendous amount of time preparing for next Monday's webinar. So we may do live group coaching, so be thinking about that. In live group coaching, you get an opportunity to bring your discussion topics and anything that you want to talk about in any area of business, and we'll do our very best to support you how we can during the context of that conversation. But let me know what kind of topics that you would like for me to address at paulssurvey.com, because we always like to get feedback from our audience, and we like to talk about the things that you will find most interesting and most valuable to you. And in between now and the time that we meet again next Monday, I strongly encourage you to do your homework and be thinking about our virtual planning event, our Awaken CEO Strategic Planning virtual event that we do every quarter. Our next one is going to be on Saturday, December the 5th. You can go to paulhoyt.com/strategize with Paul and sign up for that if you'd like to join us on that. And I strongly encourage you to do so. And with that, let's go into open Q&A and coaching. First, I would encourage you to ask questions and have comments related to the subject matter of today. And then once we've concluded that discussion, we can jump in and talk about anything that you would like to talk about in business. And we have some time here because this was a fairly short presentation for today. So I encourage us to have a lot of questions and a lot of comments and discussion around the subject of establishing a joint venture. Stephanie, do we have any questions or discussion topics for today?
Yeah, let's get started. First one.
Okay.
How do I decide whether or not to start a new company?
That's a very, very good question. And I generally say that if you have an ongoing company and you're wanting to open up a new division of that company, there are two primary considerations that you might have when it comes to starting up, whether you decide that to be a wholly owned subsidiary and actually a portion of your existing company, or whether you decide that that's going to be, a separate company in its entirety. And those two primary considerations are the investment profile and the risk profile. So if you're going to require new investors in a new venture, then it's oftentimes a good idea to set up a new company, because otherwise people will be investing in the entire company that's already in place. If, for example, in many of the examples that we talked about today, you do require a fairly hefty investment from two or more parties, it's always a good idea to set up a new venture to do that, because the new venture will have a different investment profile than would either one of the two companies that were out there. The second consideration is the risk profile. So if the new company or the new venture has a different risk profile than the existing one, then oftentimes it's a good idea to set up a different company to shield the parent company or companies from any sort of risk they might entail with the new warehouse or with the new venture. And the warehouse is a very good example of that, because a warehouse with forklifts and heavy equipment and it carries a different risk profile than, say, a product or service company is. So if I have a product company and you have a product company, but our products are currently being created overseas and they're being delivered to our clients through fulfillment centers, neither one of our companies has the risk profile of running and managing a warehouse. We don't have forklifts. We don't have people up on ladders. We don't have trucks coming in and out and people moving heavy things. So our risk profile is much different if all we have is a white-collar venture that is managing the delivery of products and services through third parties. So it's a very good idea when we have a warehouse to form a separate company which has a much different risk profile. Another reason to do it, by the way, when it comes to joint ventures is branding protection and branding awareness. So for example, I've got a company that, let's say I've got a white-collar company and you've got a white-collar company, and we decide to open up a joint venture for a daycare center. Neither one of us has room within our existing facility for a daycare center, so we decide to set up a separate company to have a daycare center that's going to offer daycare services to your employees and to my employees. A really good example of when it would make sense to have a separate joint venture, because neither one of us are in the daycare business itself. If we're going to start a business that offers daycare facilities to companies other than our own, we don't particularly want it to be branded with your company name or my company name. It's got a different risk profile, and it probably has a much different investment profile. So those are the big three things that I would encourage you to consider in whether or not to set up a joint venture as a separate legal entity. And that is the investment profile, the risk profile, and the brand awareness or the public relations profile of that new venture. Hopefully that was helpful and gives you a little food for thought there. Next question, Stephanie.
Okay. Is a 50-50 venture okay, or does one party need to be in control?
Generally speaking, I'm not a fan of 50-50 partnerships, generally, because in the case of a tie or in case of some sort of really strong disagreement, you really need for one party to move on. Sometimes 50-50 partnerships get stalled whenever they have a contentious issue and both parties are intractable and unwilling to negotiate and give in. What I like to have, if you want to avoid the challenges of a 50-50 partnership, is an agreed upon third party who will have 2% of the vote or 1% of the vote. So you and I, for example, could pick a CPA that neither one of us are doing business with, who we admire for having a pretty good head on their shoulders, or a consultant, a business consultant, who has a pretty good head on their shoulders, and essentially give them 1% of the voting privileges of the company. They don't have to own any rights to the asset, but they could have 1% of the votes or 2% of the votes. So if we ever find ourselves in an intractable position where we needed to have a tiebreaker of sorts, we could go to this independent third party and ask them to cast that unbalancing vote. So generally speaking, I'm a fan of 51-49 or 60-40 or 70-30 or 80-20 relationships in between two parties. If we decide it really is appropriate for us to have the 50-50 ownership in the profits of the company and in the asset value of the company, we may decide up front to avoid any sort of intractable position that we might have on a future issue that comes up by giving a third party 1% of the voting shares of the company and giving them some sort of compensation associated with that. It doesn't have to be a 1% ownership in the company. It could be, just, a contractual $1,000 a month or $1,000 a year to have that position so that we can have a chance to break the tie in case we ever need to do that. So that's so 50-50, and generally, unless you're spouse and spouse, husband and wife, or spouse and spouse in some other term, that may not make sense to have a 50-50 partnership. Hopefully that makes sense. Next question.
This is kind of an extension. Where is the line between having a partnership and joint venture? And what about if there's going to be many JV opportunities like a franchise, but more of a business opportunity?
Well, a franchise opportunity is, in fact, You know, it's a way of highly regulated joint ventures. I think that's a really good way of saying what a franchise opportunity is. Generally speaking, I've had a considerable amount of franchise experience, as has Stephanie. Stephanie's actually managed her own franchise for a while. So we're very, very knowledgeable in franchising, and that is a regulated way of establishing joint ventures with multiple franchise owners. So that's a little bit different question than having multiple JV opportunities. If you decide to have a business that you think is scalable and repeatable across many type of locations, you need to make the decision as to whether or not you're going to ramp up and take advantage of your expansion opportunities via company-owned locations or franchised locations. But that's a really good opportunity, and I'd be happy to talk to you offline about the differences in between company-owned location versus franchised locations and the pluses and the minuses of each one of those. But that is a classic way of having a heavily regulated opportunity to expand your business via joint ventures. And in that case, they're all a common theme, right? They're all Starbucks. Well, Starbucks are company owned, so that was a bad example. So that they're all Quiznos, or they're all McDonald's, or they're all some other sort of restaurant going forward, or there's lots of different franchise opportunities available to you out there. I think that the first part of that question is where do you draw the line in between having a partnership or a joint venture? And I think it's around those different issues of the investment profile, the risk profile, and the brand awareness profile that would indicate that it really might be a more appropriate as a separate company rather than just a partnership or alliance. So you and I can just form a partnership or alliance. For example, that I gave on the workshops. If we just decide to do a workshop together, we can just draw up the paperwork and draw up, some simple agreement, a contract in between the two of us, or even a series of emails about, hey, this is what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, this is how much you're going to put in, how much I'm going to put in, here's how we're going to split the profits in the end of it, here's what you're going to do, the roles and responsibilities that you have, the roles and responsibilities that I'm going to have, if we're going to hire a third party to help us manage this webinar or workshop in any sort of way. And we can do that contractually. But if the investment is significant, if it really is going to last a long time, if the risk profile is pretty substantial, we might consider setting up a joint venture, a separate company, and and invest in that joint venture appropriately, rather than just having a separate bank account or having one of the two of us be responsible for the finances of the workshop, for example. I'm not sure if that answered your question. If you're available, I think I'm going to take you off mute. I see who answered this. Asked the question, my good friend Jay. Jay, I don't know if you're available to speak online, but did I address that, or do you have a follow-up? And hello. I did take you off of mute. I don't know if you can, if you're off of mute or not. I'm guessing you are trying to be off mute, but you're not. So I'm going to put you back on mute here and invite you to have a follow-up line in the question box if you would like to have a follow-up question. Stephanie, do we have another question?
Yes, next one.
Okay.
A new business sounds expensive. How much is that going to cost?
Excellent question, because new businesses can be expensive. And the cost depends a lot on what type of business that you set up and where you set that business up. So here in California, if even LLCs have like a $250 minimum business license fee that you might have. If I set one up in downtown San Francisco, it's going to cost me more than if I set it up in, say, Fresno, California, where I'm sure that local business licenses cost less than they do in San Francisco. So the location depends a lot. And it's not only the location and the business licenses or the franchise taxes that they might have on your venture, just as kind of an overhead, but it also could be the income tax on the venture if in fact you set up a C corporation, which is a taxable entity. The other types of organizations that we put out there, LLC and S Corp and partnerships, are pass-through organizations typically, where they would not have a tax liability. But if you choose to have a C corporation, then you're going to have corporate income tax. And some states have corporate income tax, and some states have higher corporate income tax than other states. California, New York is really pretty high. Texas, Nevada has no corporate income tax. Well, I'm not sure about corporate income tax in those states. I know personal income tax, they don't have it. But anyway, check with the state that you're setting up so to see whether or not there's any corporate income tax. So that's part of the cost. There's certainly the cost of doing the tax returns. So anytime you have a separate entity, you'd have to pay, you know, $1,000, $1,500, $2,000 a year every single year in order to file the corporate tax returns. So in any one of those cases, a partnership, an LLC, an S Corp, an LLC taxed as an S Corp, or a C Corp, you're going to have some expense necessary every year to create the tax return, to create the K-1s that go out to the partners and the owners of the business, and to issue the returns to the state and federal governments. So those are the two big, you know, expenses that you might have: business licenses and taxes. There's also the cost of forming the company in the first place. So you may go to LegalZoom. Of course, it's going to be very inexpensive. We know some entities such as Laughlin Associates that do a very inexpensive and high quality job in helping you set up your new entity. And you can form one with your regular attorneys if you'd like to do that as well. And that's part of the cost of forming a new entity. I will say that some of the cost of forming a new entity has not a thing to do with the legal structure. It has to do with talking through the agreement. If we decide that we're going to have a C corporation, for example, there are some very commonly accepted bylaws of a C corporation that are rarely negotiated very much. So it may not take us very long at all in order to establish the bylaws of a C corporation. That's not necessarily true with an LLC or a partnership. It is true, by the way, with an S Corp. So an S Corp would have bylaws which are very similar to a C corporation, and it wouldn't require a tremendous amount of time and effort to talk through the bylaws of a C Corp or an S Corp. But if it's an LLC or a partnership, you know, the particulars of those relationships are defined in the LLC by the operating agreement, and in a partnership by the partnership agreement, and that can take hours and hours and days to talk through. The advantage of those types of legal entities is that they have a lot of flexibility in the legal structure themselves about how the thing is going to be managed, about who's going to own what, who's going to have the rights to the appreciation of the asset value, who's going to have the rights to the profits or the revenues of the company, who's going to be responsible for, you know, the expenses of the company, who's going to have the right to take on their income tax return, any sort of loss position that might be there. And my experience is when it comes to LLCs and partnership agreements is they take hours and hours and hours and days in order to talk through, and there's a lot of legal expense to talk through those as well. So that's one of the considerations when it comes to the cost of forming a separate venture. You know, how much is it going to cost to create it in the first place? You know, what is the tax profile and where are we going to set it up? What sort of legal entity are we going to have? And if it's an LLC or a partnership, you know, how much time and money are we going to spend in actually negotiating the agreement in the first place? That's one of the hidden costs of setting up a venture, is the cost of the time that it takes and the legal fees that it takes in order to negotiate an effective LLC operating agreement or a partnership agreement. So thank you for that question. That was a pretty good one. Next question, Stephanie.
Okay.
If you have any more.
How do I find a JV partner?
Good question. I think you find a JV partner from your existing alliances and partnerships. So I don't recommend, usually speaking, that the first time that you do a deal with somebody that it's in the form of a separate company. It could be, for an example that I gave earlier about the company formed in Texas to do research on semiconductor and technology. You know, Texas Instruments, IBM, and Intel were competitors with each other, and I don't know if they had actually partnered in any way before, or whether that venture was the first cooperative venture that they had had. Certainly is a possibility it was the first time that those three parties came together and worked together in any way. But generally speaking, I encourage you to have an alliance relationship, a partnering relationship, a good working relationship with anybody that you would consider having as a co-owner of a separate business, because there's additional hassle and additional agreements that need to be done, need to be created and managed with regards to that. So having a really, really good working relationship is a pretty darn good idea. So that's the first place that I would look for any sort of thinking about having a joint venture and setting up a separate company, would be with my existing alliance partners, my existing strategic alliance partners, to see if any of those folks were interested. And if not, then I would look with any sort of networking organizations that I have, and I would look for people in my existing networking organizations to recommend people that they have done business with in the past. So if I haven't done business with them before, then I'm certainly going to look to some of my other trusted colleagues, and I'll trust people that they trust before I'll just raise my hand up and say, hey, is anybody out there that's unknown to me and unknown to anybody that I know interested in forming a joint venture and another company? That seems like a really good idea, a really good way to make a really big mistake. So if it's not somebody that you know and trust, at least make it somebody that is known and trusted by people that you do know and trust. Once you start getting more than 1 degree of separation away, I think that your risk increases. And when you start getting into the area of multiple degrees of separation away, or into the area of somebody that nobody knows what it's like to do business, then you really have to take extra precautions to do your due diligence. Make sure you check to ensure that this person is not somebody who loves to engage in litigation, etc. So that's where I'd look first, amongst the people I already know and trust, friends and family, people I've done business with in the past, etc. Stephanie, do we have any other questions for today?
Yeah.
Okay.
How do I expand into a foreign country?
Expanding into the foreign country. We kind of mentioned this earlier before, but expanding into the foreign country oftentimes requires you to have some sort of relationship, and it could be a partner relationship or just a contractual relationship with the company that is 51% owned by citizens of that foreign country. So once you decide that, hey, I want to go into Mexico, or I want to go into Germany, or I want to go into Italy, or I want to go into someplace in Asia, and you understand the legal requirements of doing business in that foreign country, then you get to decide whether or not you do it with a joint venture with a separate company that's owned 51% by a citizen of that foreign country, or whether or not you do it with a contract, as we do many strategic alliances and partnerships with foreign countries. I used to work for software companies that would distribute their products over in Europe, and they had to distribute their products in Europe through relationships with companies that were established in those countries. But they didn't do it by establishing a new company. They did it by having a contractual relationship with the software distribution partner who is already doing business in that foreign country. So those are the two big things to understand, is how do we actually do business in that country, and then make a decision whether it makes sense to do it through an alliance and a partnership, or whether it makes sense to do it by forming a new company and doing it with regards to a joint venture. I've got about 12:52, so we have an opportunity for one or more questions related to the subject matter of the day. Or, of course, if you're on the call and we're kind of getting to the tail end of these questions, if you've got anything else that you'd like for us to talk about, any other subjects of business, we're happy to address those as well. That being said, Stephanie, do we have any other questions, comments, or discussion topics for today?
I don't see any. It looks like that's it.
Well, cool. Well, thank you very much for attending today's call, for those of you who are dialed in via the telephone and those of you who are joining us online. We're really happy that you're able to join us today. If you're listening to this recording, I strongly encourage you to listen to any one of the other 90-some recordings that we have available in our office hours portal, because we are committed, as we said earlier, to your success. We want to do everything that we can to help accelerate the growth and increase the probability of survival and reduce the struggle of businesses in America. Until we meet again, I wish everybody on the call a very, very happy Thanksgiving holiday. I encourage you to think about all the things in your life that you are grateful for and count the blessings that you have. And until we meet again, this is Paul Hoyt wishing you a most marvelous and prosperous day. Bye-bye.